Keeping with the 2019 theme, today's message is called Rise. Rise up or arise. And I thought it was an appropriate theme to talk about as the first Sunday of the new year. And the text from which we will be talking is taken from John chapter 5, verses 1 through 9. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda. It has 5 arcades. In these there used to lie a great number of sick persons and of people who were blind or lame or paralyzed. And there was one man there who had been an invalid for 38 years. Jesus saw him lying there, and knowing that he had been a long time in that condition, he asked him, "Do you wish to have health and strength?" "Sir," replied the sufferer, "I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is moved. But while I am coming, someone else steps down before me." "Rise," Jesus said. "Take up your mat and walk." Instantly, the man was restored to perfect health, and he took up his mat and he began to walk. And I will tell you and share with you that for the longest time, this particular story didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Because it's about a man, as we've read about, who barely has enough faith to stand. And yet Jesus treats him like he's an Abraham or something who's just put his son on a sacrificial altar. Maybe martyrs, maybe apostles deserve that kind of honor, but not some poor pauper who doesn't even know Jesus when he even sees him. Or at least that's what I used to think. I thought the story was just a little too good to be true. And then I realized that this particular story isn't just about some invalid in Jerusalem some 2,000 years ago. It's actually a story about me. And maybe you too. Because that man isn't some just nameless disabled person. He had a name, and he has one today, and it's mine. And he also has a face, and maybe it's yours. And he has a problem just like us. You see, Jesus has encountered this man near a very large pool that was north of the temple in Jerusalem. It measured 360 feet long. It was 130 feet wide. And it was in parts up to 75 feet deep. And a colonnade with these 5 porches overlooked this body of water. And it was more or less a monument to the wealth and the prosperity of a country. But its occupants were the sick and the diseased. They called it Bethesda, which was the Hebrew word that they used for it, but they could have called it Balboa Park. They could have called it Metropolitan Hospital. They could have called it Joe's Bar and Grill, for that matter. It could be the homeless that huddle underneath the freeway overpass. It could be any collection of hurting people. And there was an underwater spring that fed this pool. And occasionally the spring would cause bubbles to go up to the top. And the hurt and the hopeless believed that these bubbles were actually the stirring of the waters by angels' wings. And it was further believed that once the angels' wings had stirred the water, if you could be the first to come into contact with that water, you would be healed. Now, did healing actually occur? I do not know. But I know that crowds of invalids would come to give it a try because what else did they have to lose? I want you to picture a battleground that is strewn with wounded bodies. And if you can do that, you see Bethesda. Imagine a nursing home that's overcrowded and understaffed, and you see this pool of Bethesda that's being described. Picture the orphans in Bangladesh or the abandoned people in New Delhi, and you'll see what people saw when they passed Bethesda. And you can just imagine, what do you think they heard as they were passing by this crowd of people? It was probably this endless wave of groaning and moaning. And what did they witness? They witnessed a football-sized field of faceless need. So what did the people do? Most walked past, ignoring the people who were suffering. But not Jesus. Jesus, reminding you, is now in Jerusalem for a feast. It's the Passover. But this time, Jesus is without his posse. He's alone. He doesn't have his disciples with him. He's not there to teach his disciples. He's not there to draw a crowd. The people need him, so Jesus is there. And I want you to picture that. Jesus walking among the suffering. And what is he thinking? I mean, an infected hand reaches out and touches Jesus' ankle. What does he do? How about when a blind child stumbles into Jesus' path? Does he reach down to catch him or reach down to catch her? When a wrinkled hand extends to Jesus for alms, how does Jesus respond? And church, whether the hole is Bethesda or it's Joe's Bar and Grill, how does God feel when people hurt? And the answer is, all you have to do is walk with Jesus. Watch Jesus walk through this location in Bethesda. And it's worth retelling this story just to know that Jesus even came. I mean, he didn't have to. Surely there were far more sanitary crowds that Jesus could have been hanging out with in Jerusalem at the time. There was a lot more enjoyable activities that Jesus could have been doing while he was in town. I mean, this is the Passover feast. People are coming from hundreds of miles to meet God in the temple in Jerusalem. It's a time for celebration. It's a time for happiness. It's a time for reconnecting with God. Surely Jesus could have found something else better to do than to spend his time at the pool of Bethesda. Little did they know that God was slowly walking, stepping carefully between the lame and the blind and the infirmed. Little did the people there in Jerusalem know at the time that this strong young carpenter who surveyed this ragged landscape of pain was literally God in the flesh. Isaiah 63 verse 9, not far from the passage that Curtis read to us this morning, says, when they suffered, he suffered also. And on this day, I'm just imagining, Jesus suffered a great deal. Because on this particular day, I'm imagining that Jesus must have sighed heavily as he walked along this poolside at Bethesda. And he sighs, church, when he comes to you and he comes to me, because there we are. There we are filling the white space of verse 5, which says, quote, a man was lying there who had been sick for 38 years. Now, maybe you don't like being described that way. Maybe you'd rather see yourself with the courage of David, or maybe the devotion of Mary. And the truth is, we would all like to see ourselves that way. But before you and I can be anything like a David or like a Mary, we've got to come to grips with the fact that we're just like the paralytic. We are invalids without any options. We can't walk. We can't work. We can't care for ourselves. We can't roll down the bank to the pool and cash in on the angel water. We're powerless. We're flat on our backs, and we've been this way for longer than we care to remember. Now, granted, you and I might walk bolt upright, have 20/20 vision, and can't imagine what you and this 40-something invalid have in common. I mean, how could I even begin to suggest that you or I have something in common with him? We don't. Or do we? What do we possibly have in common with that guy at Bethesda? And the answer is very simple. We have an identical predicament. And the predicament that I'm talking about is described in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14, that says the following: anyone whose life is not holy will never see the Lord. That, church, is our predicament. Only the holy are going to see God. Holiness is a prerequisite to heaven. And I wish it weren't so. And sometimes we act as if it isn't. We act like those who are decent or kind will see God. We suggest that those who try hard enough will see God. We act as if we're good if we never do anything too bad. And that goodness is enough to qualify us for heaven. That sounds right to us, but it doesn't sound right to God, because God sets the standard, and the standard's pretty high. Matthew chapter 5, verse 48 says, "You must be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect." You see, in God's plan, God is the standard for perfection. We don't get to compare ourselves to other people. They're just as messed up as we are. The goal is to be like him, and anything less is inadequate. And that's why I suggest we're just like the invalid. Because we're paralyzed. We're trapped. We're stuck. And we have no solution for our predicament. So, in a sense, that's you and that's me lying there at that pool of Bethesda. We're wounded and we're weary. And when it comes to healing our own spiritual condition, we do not have a chance. We might as well be told to pole vault the Grand Canyon, for that matter. I mean, it's impossible. We don't have what it takes to spiritually heal ourselves. Our only hope is that God will do for us what he did for the man at Bethesda, that he will step out of the temple and step into our own hospital ward of hurt and helplessness. And the good news is, church, he's done exactly that. Read Paul's description of what God has done for you and for me. This is taken from Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. When you were spiritually dead because of your sins and because you were not free from the power of your sinful self, God made you alive with Christ, and he forgave all our sins. He canceled the debt, which listed all the rules that we failed to follow. He took away that record with its rules and nailed it to the cross. God stripped the spiritual rulers and powers of their authority. With the cross, he won the victory and showed the world that they were powerless. And as you look at that verse, and as you look and see what God has done, who's doing the work here, church? You or God? Who's active in this message? You or God? Who's doing the saving? You or God? Who's the one with the strength and who's the one who's paralyzed? Just look at our condition. When you were spiritually dead and you were not free, the invalid was better off than we are. At least he was alive. Paul says that if you and I are outside of Jesus Christ, then we're dead. Spiritually dead. Corpses. Lifeless. Dead. And what can a dead person do? Not much. But look at what God can do with the spiritually dead. Look at the emphasized portions of that same text. God made you alive. God forgave. He canceled the debt. He took away the record. God stripped the spiritual rulers. He won the victory. He showed the world. And again, the question is, who's active in this imagery? You and I or God? Who's trapped and who comes to the rescue? You know, God has thrown life jackets to every generation. So go back to Bethesda with me for just a moment. Because before Jesus heals the man, he asks him a question. Do you want to have health and strength? In other words, Jesus is looking at an invalid who's been in that condition for 38 years and says, would you like to be better? It seems like a silly question to me. Of course he'd want to be healed. But maybe the man had grown so accustomed to his disability that he preferred the pain of what he knew versus the terror of what he hadn't known for almost 40 years. But church, that's faith. It's the confidence in the things we hope for, and it is the conviction of what we don't really see still actually exists. That's what the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. So in verse 7, the invalid says, Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is moved. But while I am coming, someone else steps down before me. And that's an interesting exchange. I mean, is this guy complaining to Jesus? Is he feeling sorry for himself? Or maybe he's just stating the facts. Who knows? But before we think about that too much, look what happens next. Rise, Jesus says. Take up your mat and walk. Instantly, the man was restored to perfect health, and he took up his mat and began to walk. I wish we would do that. I wish we would take Jesus at his word. I wish that we would learn that when he says something, it happens. What is this paralysis that so confines us spiritually? What's this stubborn unwillingness to be healed? When Jesus tells us to stand, let's stand. When he says we're forgiven, let's unload the guilt. When he says we're valuable, let's believe him. And when he says that we are eternal, then let's bury our fear. When he says that we are provided for, let's stop worrying. When he says rise, let's rise. It reminds me of a story of a private who served in Napoleon's army. And this particular private had the task of trying to catch Napoleon's runaway horse. And when he brought the animal back to the emperor, because he had successfully caught the horse that had strayed away, Napoleon thanked him by saying the following: "Thank you, Captain." Now remember, before the event, he was a private. Napoleon says, "Thank you, Captain." You see, with one word, the private had been promoted. When the emperor said it, the private believed it. He went to the quartermaster, he selected his new uniform and put it on. He went to the officers' quarters and he selected a bunk. He went to the officers' mess and had a meal with the other officers. Because the emperor had said it, he believed it. And would we do the same? So the question is Bethesda just this interesting story about an invalid who lived some 2,000 years ago, who happened to run into Jesus Christ and was given a new life? Is that just some old story, or is Bethesda your story? Maybe so, because it seems to me that the elements are very similar. In fact, they might be the same. A gentle stranger has stepped into your hurting world and offered you to take a hand. And then he says, "Rise up." And my encouragement to you this morning is to take his hand and do it. 2019 has all the possibilities of being a very interesting year if 2018 is any shadow of what we can expect. But you don't have to be fearful, because God is still in charge. And when he says that he's in control, then believe that he's in control. When he says that you need help, believe that you do. And when he says that he's offering you that help, then take it. And I realize most of you here are Christians. But if you're not, you're just like that invalid. You're spiritually dead and you need help. And Jesus is offering you the opportunity to get well and to be better. Now is the time to accept that. Because the only people who are going to get into heaven and see God are the perfect people. And unless I haven't met you yet, I don't know too many perfect people. We're all messed up. We're all like that invalid. We all need the healing. And that's where the good news of Jesus Christ comes into play. Because the only way that we can be perfect is to have our messed up lives forgiven. And that's why Jesus came, to offer his sinless life as the perfect sacrifice for our sin-filled life. And that by coming into contact with Jesus through baptism, we're raised to walk in this newness of life, to where we can live a life that is forgiven. And so when Jesus says, "I've forgiven you," let's believe it. When Jesus says you don't have to worry about your past, you can get over the guilt. When Jesus says you can go out and share the good news with other people, then rise up and do it. I'm not suggesting that each of you stand on a street corner and preach the gospel, but I am suggesting that you let your life show what you've been given. You've been given your spiritual life back to you. And let your life reflect that, so that in the conduct you have with the people you come into contact with, whether it's a grocery store, or it's a service station, or it's at your employer, or it's at home, let your life reflect the fact that, like the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda, you've been healed. So this year, church, rise up. Believe Jesus when he tells you that you're important. Believe Jesus when he tells you that you're forgiven. Believe Jesus when he tells you that he has so much in store for you. When Jesus says, "Rise up," let's do that. Let's stand up and be accounted for, and stand up and share the good news with a hurting world in the community in which we live. So we've selected the next song. Chrissy, thank you. Out of my bondage, sorrow, and strife, Jesus, I come. Jesus, I come. Read the words, sing the words, believe the words. Share your heart as you're singing this song. It's an invitation for you to take action, to rise up, to be the child of God that you've been called to be. So as we conclude this song, you can hand up the prayer requests that you might have. We'll pause over those for a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand, please, and let's...